July 17th on Friday. You know what that means. Annex Suspension Instagram Live. Burstcraft, thank you for joining us. We just got your question and I just wrote it down. All right. So the main topic for this Friday's Instagram Live comes up from our very own Stephen V. Van. Stephen asks, what alignment do you recommend for street/toge cars? And I think both of us thought that this was a really good topic because not only does this get asked a lot, right? Like a certain alignment settings is like, I have my NX suspension. I'm about to install it. It's going to go to alignment. What alignment settings do you recommend for me? Or they might have a general chassis, right? And it's like, what camber settings do you recommend for this car? And the problem is like all that stuff's kind of relative.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Yeah, I think this is like a recurring theme here, but it really comes down to how you're going to be using the car, and there's like more to consider too. We've been helping people with some wheel spec, fitments and answering the questions on that, or at least trying to. And sometimes the alignment comes down to just will the wheels fit, right? So it really depends on what you're trying to get out of it. Have you had any experiences like that yourself, Ezekiel?
Really quick, Victoria says we got to speak up, so no
Okay.
problem. I'll turn the volume down and then we'll project our voice.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting us know, Victoria. So I'll turn the mics down, but then we'll speak up.
Okay.
So A Duran 916 must be from Sacramento, says, I need some Evo coilovers. Which generation Evo do you have, A Duran? And 916, if you're in Sac, come down and visit us.
Yeah, we're right here in Fremont, not too far away.
Yes. Our very own Tyler from the R&D team says, planned use, roll correction, geometry, tires, and then alignment. A. Duran says, Evo 8. We have an Evo 8, correct?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
We do have that set up.
All right. A. Duran, shoot us a DM about how the proposed use, like what do you use your Evo most for? And then we can get you set up with a coilover system that best suits your needs.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, a lot of times people will ask us when they're considering Annex Suspension, should I be getting the Fastwood Pros or the Club Spec Pros? And it kind of boils down to how, if you're going to be driving mainly on the street and going to the track occasionally, or if it's primarily a car that's going to be seeing a lot of track time and on the road a little bit less. That's one of the first questions we ask, along with, what kind of tire compounds will you be using? Will you be using, aero and other forms of downforce? And usually with those points, we can kind of start to get a feel for what kind of product is going to be more useful for you.
I was going to say, we had someone ask for S14 fronts, and we found out they were using S14 fronts in their like Starlet race car. So a lot of context is really important.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point.
So how do you want to start this discussion? Because I realize this is a very big discussion to talk about alignment. How do you want to start this off?
Well, so I'd probably ask the customer, so if someone is saying what kind of alignment would we recommend for a street or toge car, right? I'd probably start asking questions like, how many miles are you covering on a daily commute? Do you have the luxury of being maybe, do you live in the hills of like Mulholland Drive or something and it's right there and you don't really drive much else except for, go drive in the canyons and maybe you're a developer and you work from home. In that kind of scenario, you could probably have a full-on, like track alignment setup and not really have any major drawbacks because that kind of an aggressive alignment setup like that will kill the tires quicker. But if you're not putting that many miles on the car, and if you're using the tires in a loaded situation a lot of the time, that actually would make the most sense. But most of us kind of don't really live next to our favorite, stomping grounds. A lot of us still need to drive to work, or maybe we commute across California or into other states. Especially in the East Coast, we know like people often have to drive a really long time just to go to a car meet, right? And so you're putting on maybe 100 miles or more just to go meet up with some friends. And if you have a lot of camber and an aggressive alignment setting, like with the toe being, if it's like towed out or something like that, then you'll kill the tires really quickly. So I think I would start off with that kind of question first to see how what's it like in the area that you plan to drive the car, and then after that it comes down to a lot of car specific questions. So if you have a car that has unequal A arms all around, like Honda S2000, or even like the front of a Civic, like Jeff's EG Civic has a nice double A arm set up on the front. Those kinds of cars will get a lot of camber gain. So when the car is being loaded up and it's rolling, the tires will actually gain in camber as it's being loaded up, and and typically if you can get more camber onto the tire when you're loading, you'll get more grip. That's a very broad statement, but that's typically what happens. So on a setup like that, you can get away with having less camber to start with. If you have a strut setup in an older car that rolls a lot, think A86 or maybe some older Toyotas or older Japanese cars with a strut up front, then you have to run a lot of initial camber, because as the car gets loaded up, they will sometimes even lose a little bit of camber as it's rolling. So you're kind of making up for that loss as the car is rolling over. The tire's starting to roll away from the road, so you got to start with a more aggressive setup to begin with.
Duran with the Evo 8 asks a follow-up question. Serious question. How are your coilovers compared to others, or what sets you apart? I currently run ISC. So for our Evo 8, let's just talk about Evo 8 Fast Road Pro, so our street product. What sets the Fast Road Pro for Evo 8 apart from our competition?
I don't think it comes down to the application specific questions, when we talk about what sets our suspension apart from others, because all of the applications that we do a very thorough amount of R&D on, every single one. So, and this kind of comes up quite a bit. Sometimes people ask us like, yeah, what's the difference between you guys and some of the other suspension options I have out there? Because there's quite a few different options outside of us. And it really comes down to just, we're measuring each car. We are measuring the motion ratios. We're figuring out the damping with math for every single vehicle that comes into this building. And often that means that we'll come up with the curves that are specific for a certain car versus something that we just apply to a bunch of different cars. It's definitely more common in the lower priced coilover range to have a valving code that happens to work on one car that gets applied to a bunch of them. And it's easier for production if you just have a handful of valving codes that work well enough, or maybe they don't work well, but they're still being pumped out there. From a production point of view, it's a lot simpler just to build a lot of shocks with a certain shim stack up and just keep pumping those out. It's much easier. We're taking the harder route, which is also why our product is not the cheapest out there. But with that harder route means that we're building a unique valving configuration for each vehicle that we do. So I'd say the main difference is, our product will cost more than ISC's, but we're putting a lot of attention and detail into the application. And this is something that you'll feel when you drive it. It'll feel different than some of the other options out there.
I was going to mention, for me, because we put so much R&D, like every application we have out, the car's physically here. All of us physically have to touch the car. We're not going to name any names, but I know a few different coilover sets for cars that you have to modify the body, like cut or hammer parts of the body to get the suspension to fit. Or, again, because we've gone through things such as measuring the motion ratio, unsprung weight, we know the correct shock body and shock rod length, so that when you lower the car, it's, you're still have usable amount of travel. It's not, like an inch of travel left or riding on the bump stops all the time.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. We have been focusing heavily on bump stop engagement over here. And I think especially in the Fast Road Pro price range, or our options that are less expensive than that, especially ones that are coming from Asia, I don't think that is something that's really taken into consideration. And so what I mean by that is, if with a lot of the bolt-on stuff, there may be a bump stop, or sometimes it's not even a bump stop on the suspension. But when that bump stop is fully engaged, it may not be designed to actually work with the car. So it may not protect the tires from hitting the chassis, or maybe it'll engage way too soon and cause a loss of performance. So when we're doing development, we're checking actually when the bump stop's engaging to try and see like, hey, if someone is typically using this tire size, this width, this diameter wheel, and we have a bump stop height of this much, with the amount of stroke that we have, are we going to be hitting at the right point, or do we need to have more stroke or less stroke, or have a different bump stop configuration? And that all these factors will help to make the suspension feel more of like a it's an engineered solution rather than cobbling together some parts and just making it fit on the car.
Brandon from North Carolina, Bermuda 86. Thank you for joining us on the live, Brandon. I got an alignment on my E86 after installing the Annex Fast Road Pros. I ended up raising the front 5 mil after my alignment was done. Do I need another alignment?
5 millimeters. So it's about half a centimeter. That's you know what? I don't know how you feel about this, Ezekiel, but I personally would just get the toe set correctly again. And I don't think that ride height change is enough to want to, need to set the camber and the caster again. But what do you think of this?
Better safe than sorry, but that's another thing to consider during alignment is that the alignment can actually change the vehicle ride height. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, for example, on a strut car, if you go excessive negative camber, it'll lower the car. So that's one thing to take into consideration if you're bringing, especially like your track vehicle to the alignment place. Like that's why kind of alignment and corner balance kind of go hand in hand, right? Because you corner balance the car, it might throw off the alignment. That's what makes alignment such a broad and tough question.
Interesting. Yeah. And to give you guys some context, if you guys aren't familiar already, Ezekiel is an ASC Master Tech, so he has a lot of experience with messing around with a lot of customer cars. So I wasn't aware that ride height would change a whole lot with an alignment setting, but we'll look to him for that kind of feedback.
John Yim, former FD driver, Ghost 86. Do you feel like the AE86 true rear coilover setup requires reinforcement to the shock towers? A question that we get
often.
Every day? Almost every day? 3 times a week at least?
It's pretty often, yeah. I mean, to be totally transparent, these cars, and a lot of cars that have true rear options fitted to them, to give you some examples, like 350Z, 370Z, it's popular to convert that car to a true rear coilover where you, instead of having the shock and the spring inboard on the rear suspension with like the OEM setup, to make it easier to have spring changes, like spring rate changes, and to be able to adjust the coilovers, and also to have a lower unsprung weight, people will often convert it into a true rear coilover where you've got the spring and the shock on the same assembly, and you're no longer using the springs in the factory position. But what does this do? It means that you're putting the spring load directly onto the shock mounting point, which was originally designed to only be dealing with shock forces and not the whole weight of the car and the spring, if that makes sense. So if you're converting to that kind of system, then you might not be able to. You just have to be careful that you're not driving the car excessively hard on the track or on the street. And I think, to make it very short, like, although it wasn't designed for that, we found with certain applications that there might be enough sheet metal, or if the suspension is designed properly, that you're not inserting a whole bunch of force onto that part of the chassis. So if if you have a properly designed suspension, I think it improves the chances that you won't have any trouble. But we do recommend for a lot of people that if you are driving on the street a lot and you want to be able to just load up the car quite a bit, be able to drive it, hard, not want to be able to, and not need to check what's going on back there often. A lot of times keeping it with the original divorce style setup might make more sense. If you have a track car, or if you are an aggressive driver that's often tinkering with your car, I think it would make more sense to do a true rear setup and get the benefits of being able to change the spring rates and being able to have a lower unsprung weight and all the benefits of that. Basically a more modern setup. But just keep an eye on it, because it wasn't designed for that, and we do the best that we can. But at the end of the day, it's up to the limits of the chassis, right?
Rob, Destiny, the S2K, thank you for joining us. You have a very interesting question that I'm interested in as well. How much does brake bias affect coilover development?
Oh, interesting. I haven't heard that question before. Who asked that one?
Rob.
Rob. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Nice question, Rob.
yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that brake bias changes our valving or springs choices, but brake bias is definitely something that's important when you change the suspension. So if you have an OEM car, it's designed to have a certain amount of a weight transfer going to the front, with the given tires. So the engineers will set up that bias so that if you're slamming on the brakes, given the factory tires and the factory spring rates and the amount of dive that vehicle has, they'll set up the bias to be, try to get the most out of it. So meaning you're having the rear wheels lock up around the same time as the fronts. That's how you're going to get the most effective use of that contact patch. So what's interesting is if you take that same stock car and you put an R comp tire on it and you go do the same test, you will. Let me see if I can remember this correctly. Yeah, the rear tires will lock up much sooner than the fronts because now those front tires have so much more grip. You're transferring a lot more weight onto the front tires, and the rear is getting a lot lighter than it was designed for. So it's pretty wild on our own track car when we go from a street tire to an R comp tire. We'll have to adjust the brake bias a decent amount, but once and to keep it from fishtailing basically. But once that's adjusted, like you get a lot more braking grip back. So I guess in short, I wouldn't say that we would design the suspension differently for that, but it's definitely something that you should consider if you're making a major change in tires and spring rate changes or shock changes. So yeah, I appreciate the question. That was a good one.
I thought that was good for a couple of reasons because I'm fighting brake bias on my own car. And then also because we sponsored the 8-6 Drive Challenge series up here in NorCal, I know a lot of those guys will run a big brake, like two different manufacturer big brake kits on the front and rear because some guys like I like more brake bias in the rear or they'll play with compounds.
Yeah.
Same thing when we do development here. A question I get that gets asked a lot for those cars is like, what tires do they run? Because there's classes that have a spec tire. You can only run that tire, which makes it important for to know how to tune the suspension in that regard. All right. Hey, Duran, a lot of these kids these days buy coils for all that hot shit and then complain about it. And
Yeah.
then he also says, Annex, I think we may have to link up soon. Not soon, right now, man. Right after this, send us a DM. We'll get you set up.
Yeah, I mean, there's often a saying like buy it. I feel like, yeah. So a lot of times people will buy something because it's less expensive and then find that it wasn't really meeting what they wanted out of it and having to buy it again. And it's not ideal, but honestly, I think it's part of the learning process. I think the reason why guys that have been doing this for a while, such as myself and Ezekiel, the reason why we care about this and why we started this company is because we have gone through that process and didn't and weren't quite finding what we were looking for. So now we're kind of speaking to the people that have gone through different setups and just want to get something that just works well out of the box, the first time. May not be the cheapest, but when you figure if you're a really busy individual, how many times do you want to be taking the suspension on and off the car and aligning it, and maybe having to try to deal with customer support that's not great. So yeah, I mean, I feel the same way, but I think it's part of the learning process for some of the younger generation. But we as guys have been doing this longer, we can kind of just try to, I guess do live streams like this and just try to educate more people, right? I think a lot of it just comes down to education.
Steven's next question: should I get a sway bar when upgrading my suspension? If so, why? I have a real world example. So, my customer who got Fast Road Pro for his AE86, you recommended to him stock rear bar and then upgraded Cusco front bar, and then he had 7K front and 5.5 rear. So why in that case did you recommend a bigger front sway bar for him?
So if you have a street or like spirited, like car that you're going to drive spiritedly, sway bars are usually good when coupled with a suspension that's not overly stiff. So we really want a suspension that will soak up those bumps and on those back roads and absorb those surface irregularities. But when you have a softer spring rate, no matter what, the car is ultimately going to come to a certain amount of roll, regardless of what dampers are on there. Eventually, it's going to get to the same point of roll. So what we can do on a street car is we can add aftermarket sway bars that are stiffer to reduce the roll. And that way, you're getting better ride quality because the actual spring rate is still lower. So you can have the wheel articulate. But when it comes time to deal with chassis roll, the larger sway bars will help to keep that more planted. In this particular niche case with the 86, we found that having larger rear sway bars on these cars can take away a lot of grip coming out of turns. So I usually will advise our customers to use a stiffer rear spring and then bounce it out with a larger front bar and keep a stock rear sway bar, because you'll in that way you'll have less inside wheel pickup, and that means that you can get more power as you get on the throttle coming out of turns.
Yeah. Adrian says, yes, you should upgrade the sway bar. But as we just heard, not in every case. I know we have a few drivers that, for example, Joe McGuigan, who has been on the live stream before, he had to disconnect the rear sway bar on his MRS, on his old setup, because he was picking wheels off the ground. And back to the question about buying once the first time. Two separate people, Tyler from the R&D team and then our neighbor Burstcrafton from Fremont, California, both said, buy once, cry once. Burstcraft also adds, and enjoy the quality product to start. So much better than buying cheap and hating it and then have to save and rebuy a better product later.
Not to mention wear and tear on your car. I mean, I'm really sympathetic to the cars that I drive, and sometimes some of these setups are so harsh you can just hear the interior rattling, and that's never going to be okay again. You're gonna have to fix a lot of stuff to get that back to being nice and quiet like OEM.
Destiny the S2K, Rob asks another question. How much does developing suspension revolve around the driver? The driver's preferences and their technique for competition use?
Yeah, I mean, while we've been working with various drivers around the country, definitely the driving style will influence what we build for the race programs. Guys that spend a lot of time on track are really gonna have a feel for the kind of driving style that they are that they're used to and what they're looking for out of the suspension. So there can be two quick drivers. Some drivers want will want kind of a little bit of a mild push going through the turn so they can kind of roll on the throttle and get as much exit speed coming out. Some drivers really want a lot of rotation, so they'll want the rear to step out so they can get that nose point in towards the apex. In either of those situations, we have some changes on the dampers and especially the spring rates to help us achieve that goal. So, yeah, it does depend on the driver's preferences, and to a degree, we can get that input from an end customer, but most of that tuning is going to have to go with the initial spring rate choices that we help them pick, and then after that, they can do some fine tuning with sway bars or adjusting the dampers to kind of get the feel that they're looking for.
T-Rod MR2, who has a MRS. I see in your picture it's at Laguna Seca, so you must be local to us. Do you have the capability to manufacture drop spindles, or do you have contacts for that? MRS specifically has abysmal front roll center when lowered. Any appreciable amount. Extended ball joints bad.
I'm actually curious. So I don't have any experience with extended ball joints, but I would love to hear your input on why you don't like those. As far as manufacturing spindles, like, yes, we do have contacts for that, and but like many things, it comes down to market demand. So to take on a project like that, it would definitely have a lot of time involved, a lot of testing. So it's possible that product could be made, but it really depends on how much demand there is in the marketplace. It does seem like MRSs are really picking up, though. I think it seems like it's a well-kept secret that's starting to kind of get out there. We've talked on this live stream before about how much we like those cars and how fun they are.
T-Rod MR2, I'd really like to know why you think extended ball joints are bad. Is this only in the lower control arm for an MRS? Is there some issue with that? Or in general, do you just think extended ball joints to correct roll center is bad? Because I'd really like to know. We have 14 people on the live stream. Today's, for you 14 people that just joined us on the live stream, our topic today is alignment settings. So any alignment questions or any questions at all you have to ask, please let us know. Burstcraft, since you are on the live and we got your question right before we started the live, we will get you an answer right now. What do you think have been the biggest improvements in suspension tech in the last 5, 10, or 20 years? And how do you see these improvements making their way into the Annex product? That's an excellent question. And to put that into some context, a lot of these golden era chassis that are experiencing a resurgence, like Jeff Wolfson's EG Civic, EK, DC2, all those MRS, all those golden era chassis that are experiencing this resurgence, people are starting to, they're appreciating in value. People are taking them to the track. And because they've only just recently been appreciated, a lot of the suspension technology is like from 10 years ago. So what modern improvements have made their way into the Annex product that you can think of?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic. You know, it's funny. Like at the turn of the century, there were dampers that were just basically friction devices that would be a lever and then some kind of drum that you would tighten or loosen to create damping. It's just a sliding friction device. And from that, then they came up with some like a piston with just some holes in it going through some fluid, but that had its own drawbacks, such as huge amounts of progression in the shock, and then that was around like the 50s. But that was a big improvement, right? Because you have a hydraulic fluid and a piston going through it. Even though the curves weren't what we would want today, it was still a major improvement over a friction device, right? And then and yeah, and then going into and then there was shim stacks that came out, which is the foundation for most modern shock absorbers, I'd say, in the last maybe 50 years or so. And that's deflective disc shim stacks, which is like pretty much any aftermarket or even OEM suspension out there today. And yeah, just seeing that progression has been really interesting. And then going into the Formula One side, there are things like inverters and other devices that can take out the really high frequency movements of the tire actually and dampen the tire rather than the suspension piece. So there've been really large progressions over time. But I think the biggest thing that really has moved forward the technology on dampers has been Formula One or similarly high levels of motorsport. And a lot of this comes down to the tolerances that you can build for the shock absorbers. Tolerances are something that we've spent a lot of time looking into, because it turns out that if you have a shim stack that is, that has a tiny gap, like 0.001 millimeter, is something that you might notice on the actual dyno if you have that bit of a gap on a sealing ring, and being able to have machines that can make higher and higher tolerance devices allow you to have a damper that works in Formula One, which will often have a stroke of maybe this much. For those of you that are listening, maybe it's like the stroke might be like an inch or so, but the wheel's moving quite a bit, and you have to develop a lot of force for that. And so having the machinery that can make those tolerances is what really allows you to control the wheel and tire package even on an application like that. So for us, as we kind of study these high-end dampers, a lot of it is just figuring out when is it really critical to have very close tolerances, just on the basic shim stack on a piston design. I can also say there's some other internal things that we're studying on making some changes for future motorsport projects. That'll trickle down, but I can't really talk about those too much at this time. But yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of enhancements that have happened over the years, so it's really interesting.
T-Rod MR2 has a rebuttal for us about extended ball joints to correct roll center. He says, complicated, but without double shear is weak. How it's designed puts too much load. It's not like S2K where you can just space it out, for example. While he was writing this down, I thought about other cars other Toyota chassis from the era that actually have lower ball joint problems.
Oh yeah.
So GS300, Mark IV Supra, IS300, it's all the same pretty much knuckle design. That's
Mm.
why you can put TT Supra calipers on a GS300. And all those cars, yeah, they apparently have lower ball joint longevity issues. So, I imagine the MRS may be similar. It's like the similar vintage of those cars also.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I guess since the ball joint isn't in double shear, it's more likely you can damage the ball joint. So it's basically not safe, is what I'm hearing. Which yeah, that sounds scary, doesn't it?
Racing Passion 1, thank you again for joining the podcast, the live stream. This will be on podcast this coming Monday in case for you guys that just joined us. Hey guys, just wanted to ask, where can I get a dyno clamp as the one you used on the upper part of your dyno, the one that holds the shaft of the damper?
Well, I mean, all these parts have to be manufactured. You can talk to various dyno manufacturers. There's a few out there. There's not a whole lot of companies that make dynos, but yeah, you could reach out to them and see what see if they'll sell you something.
DC5 Twisties, thank you for joining us on the live stream again. How much is too much negative camber for a 300 or 200 tread wear tire?
So that really depends.
I know I was gonna say that's a pretty open question,
Yeah,
right?
but
Like what chassis, what tire is it? What are you using the car for? What's really right? Are you drag racing with the car? That stuff like that, right?
yeah.
So I think we need more. Do you want more information on that one?
No, not really, because like yes, Ezekiel's totally right. We would need more context, but we'd be answering a question for just one particular car. I think just some general guidelines would be helpful for people because some people really don't know. Like, is 5 a lot? Is 2 a lot? No idea, right? If let's just take a normal car, let's just forget the suspension, setup. If it's double A arm or a strut, I don't think I would really push past maybe about 2.5 degrees or at most 3 degrees for a long-term street-driven car. And the more camber you have, and the worse your alignment is, when you have that much camber, it's going to affect those low tread wear tires even quicker. So if I had a really sticky set of tires and I was driving on the street quite a bit, I would probably be even more careful about how much ultimate camber I put in, even though you'd get more performance by having more camber probably because the car is developing more force, but you're just going to go through the tires that much quicker. So I'd say for a street driven car, probably don't want to go past 3 degrees. I'd ideally keep it around 2.5 or 2.75. And again, it could be less depending on the suspension design, but I don't think I'd go past that. And then when you do have that much camber, the toes, I'd say even more critical than it would be if you just had a tire that was straight up and down, because as these tires are leaning inwards, most of your weight is just on one part of the tire. So if you have any toe out or toe in, you're going to accentuate the wear where that load is. So you can burn through the inside of the tire very quickly.
We have a few really good comments on tire. So Tyler from the R&D group says 200 and 300 tread wear are very different. And T-Rod MR2 also says a 200 tread wear AO52 is worlds different from a 200 tread wear RS4.
Totally true.
Yeah, I completely forgot. I mean, the best example is what's the cheater tire?
You mean the one that they've been running recently?
Yeah.
Geez,
the one there's a I know.
Oh man,
we should really know it.
Long week.
Yeah, but I mean, I know there's spec classes where even though it's
AR1 Nankang, right?
No, there's
not that one.
No,
okay.
no, it's like a star spec. It's the newest one, not star spec.
Okay.
But like, even though it's a 200 tread wear, I've seen rules where they specifically ban that tire because it's like not really a 200 tread wear.
Yeah. Yeah, 200 tread wear, unless you have these tires, then it doesn't count, right?
Yeah. I'm not... Mr. McLevin, thank you for joining us. Mr. McLevin has a R32 GTR and a AE86.
Wow, the dream.
Yeah. I'm not satisfied with the US choices of coilovers for the BNR 32. I'll send mine up there so you guys can make a setup for us R32 guys. So Mr. McLevin's actually on the East Coast.
Wow.
So he's offered it's funny, I think you can confirm this if I'm right, but I think he said his Corolla is the race car and then the GTR is the street car, which is kind of...
That's funny. Yeah, I'm just curious what kind of options there are for that car. Maybe you can send us a DM and let us know what kind of brands are available for those. For a car that we rarely ever see in California, we do get a surprisingly high amount of people asking for coils for the Skyline. So who knows? Maybe if, as they become more popular, we can prioritize it.
Thank you, Tyler. RE71.
Ah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
one.
Bill the Bear, who has our WRX Wagon Fast Road Pro. Thank you for joining us, Bill. And I know you were at Laguna just the other
We
weekend,
just
and
missed you.
yeah, just missed you.
Well, I don't know how because apparently he was four-wheel sliding that thing around the track. He sent us a video clip of him just absolutely sliding his WRX wagon, which looks very stock on the outside, around this corner. It's pretty awesome.
What order of priority to adjust handling?
For alignment, I'm
Handling
guessing.
balance. Tires, springs, sway bar, dampeners, alignment. Tires, springs, sway bar, dampers, alignment. To adjust handling balance, what would you say would be like the order of operations or the order of importance?
Well, first of all, let's get tires out of the way. You should pick a tire and then stick with it. You don't want to change the handling balance by having a grippier tire in the front versus the rear because they will handle differently with different temperatures and speeds. So that could make the car unpredictable. So you don't want to do that. But once you pick a tire that you're gonna go with, um, I think the next thing would be to, in general, kind of figure out what spring rates you want because the other tuning factors will depend on that. So, try to pick a spring rate and start with that. After that, you would want to get an alignment somewhere in the ballpark for what people that have experienced that chassis would be recommending, and then you can use the sway bars to try and see if you can fine tune that. If that still doesn't work, then you can go back to changing the spring rates and the dampers to get that final balance. But it can be a little bit trial and error. Like it's hard to know right off the bat unless you have a lot of experience with the chassis what spring rates to go with. So sometimes you can kind of plan on if you get a suspension setup that isn't thoroughly tested, you may need to change the spring rates a bit before you can get the car really handling well. I hope that helps.
Chef Jeff, who runs in both 8-6 Drive Challenge and 8-6 Cup SoCal, asked us a question. And thank you for asking us a question ahead of time in either our comments or in our Instagram story. He has our Club Spec Pro for his FRS. He asks, should the second spring on a 2-spring coilover be fully compressed when the car is static? And I'm glad you asked that question because we have his exact setup right here. I think by second spring, he means the helper.
The helper spring.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, thanks, Jeff, for asking ahead of time. I was able to pull these out before the live stream so we could talk about it. But yeah, all of our Club Spec Pro products have a helper spring. We've talked about this in the past, but if you have a racing spring rate on a car, and by that I mean like, are the springs stiff enough that to get the most performance out of the tire, they're not really deflecting much when you put the car down on the ground because they're very stiff. So if you have a racing setup, the spring is not going to deflect very much. So that means that when you lower the car, you don't get very much droop because let's say the suspension's this tall and you put the car on the ground. If it can only compress this much because the springs are really, really stiff, then you also don't have any droop. So as the inside tire picks up, the shock can only extend a little bit, and that means the wheel is going up with the shock absorber. So contrary to common belief, the main purpose of the helper spring is to get more droop travel out of a race setup. So to get around the fact that your spring is very stiff, we can include a lower rate helper spring below that will compress way before the main spring up here. And so what that does is it allows the shock absorber to shorten quite a bit before the main spring is engaged. So that means that it can also extend quite a bit when the wheel drops down. And yeah, so that what that means is this spring is actually designed to be fully compressed when the car is on the ground. There are different spring rates that you can choose for these tender springs. Sometimes we'll use a spring that has some rate. Sometimes we'll use a spring that has no rate. And a lot of times that comes down to packaging considerations because we're trying to maximize the droop or the stroke that we have in our suspension. It requires us to use a pretty tall mainspring to get the most shock travel out of there. And because of that, sometimes we'll have to use a helper spring that has more flexibility in terms of its extended length and its compressed length. But either way, when you have the suspension on the car and the car's on the ground, this should be fully compressed. And so you're really relying on this as you're driving down the road, the mainspring here.
You know, a common question that I've also heard is if I choose some helper or tender springs with a spring rate, does that add to the total spring rate? And I would like you to elaborate more on that too. When we choose a helper spring with some rate in it, can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, they are. It's basically that you take the average of the two spring rates. So if you have one really stiff spring and then one lighter spring, when they're compressed, the effective spring rate is basically the combination of the two. So with some quick math, you can kind of figure out what's the effective spring rate after that change.
Okay, awesome, great. For you guys just joining us, Owinjo says it softens the initial rate.
Yeah, it can. If it's not being if that spring is not fully compressed, or if it's tall enough to compress a bit, then you could basically design a progressive spring if you have a helper spring with a lot of spring rate.
Thank you for that, Owinjo. For you guys just joining us, this is the Annex live stream, and today's topic is alignment. We have about 15 minutes left, so make sure to get your guys' questions in. We do not have any questions right now. What's the future? What future cars are we developing for Annex right now? Because that has me excited. There's a few different and completely like polar opposite chassis that are going to be here in the shop within the next week or so. What are those chassis, Grant?
Yeah, we've been looking for people that are racing the more modern Subaru chassis, because that's a market that I think could benefit from our product. So we're going to have a partner shop bring in, I believe it's an 08 STI hatchback, so we can do some development on that. We will also be bringing in a VA Subaru at some point, and we'll do development on that as well. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it turns out Jeff in his personal Honda Civic he's really thrilled with the suspension that the Club Spec Pros that he built for his Honda, and apparently his friends really liked it too. So we have quite a bit of interest on the EG and the EK platforms, which are the 90s, early 90s through mid to late 90s Honda Civics. And yeah, we're looking forward to doing more Honda tuning, so that'll be a lot of fun.
Owinjo asks a fairly tame question from usual that thank you, Owinjo. Every time I see your name, I'm about to get a heart attack. Do you guys offer differing bump stop firmness?
We have, I wouldn't say we have a whole range of bump stops that we're currently using. We have some heights with different rates that ramp up on there. And so we have a couple of bump stops that we have with different rates, but we don't have a large catalog of rates that we want to choose from. We usually just pick with our main ones.
Although one thing I think is important is bump stop compressed height.
Yeah,
because just because that thing looks really tall when it's not compressed doesn't mean it's going to compress the same length as maybe like a skinny one, right? And that's really important when you're doing when you're calculating things like bump stop height, right?
Yeah, sorry, I got a little distracted. Our social media person's just showing up to the office, so yeah.
Victoria asks, so Subaru updates? Haha.
Haha. Yes, we are looking forward to having some VA action in here, and as always, thanks again for the support, and we're really looking forward to reaching out to you when we are looking for a car or we have a product that we'd like you to try out.
So, the shop we're graciously partnering with is PM Auto Works in San Jose, California, and they are a Subaru specialist. and actually a team of Subaru
Yeah.
specialists. Back in the day, because I've known those guys, I've known at least one of them for more than 10 years. Back in the day, it was just two guys. Now they have like a staff of like 7 or 8. I was shocked
Yeah.
because we went over there and I was like, oh, I only expected two of you guys.
Yeah, the amount of Subaru knowledge in that building is pretty intense. So we're really we are really looking forward to learning more about the Subaru application from them, and seeing what we can do on the damper side to get the most out of those cars.
And just so you guys know what product to expect, the owner, Peter, has a '04 STI. We are potentially developing Fast Road Pro 4. One of the employees has a '08 STI, which we should have here. I think we're doing club spec for that one.
Mm.
And then the last one, their their sponsored driver who they want to send to Global Time Attack has a VA WRX, and we will be developing a Club Spec Pro for the VA chassis. Again, for you guys just joining us, we have just about 10 minutes left on the Instagram Live. Today's topic is alignment. There are 12 people watching right now. We need a question from one of you guys.
There's also the Miata too. That's another application that we want to get back into. We've had a fair amount of people ask us for the Miatas, especially the NAs and MBs. Unfortunately, there's we've just been really busy, and I haven't quite had someone ready to pull the trigger on that and bring the car over here. But we are looking forward to doing that car. It should be interesting with its suspension setup that's on those.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, there's so much Miata stuff on the market. I'm curious why. I've never seen anyone ask for Miata on the Instagram Live. And then I'd be curious because we do get a fair amount of inquiries for Miata. So what's wrong with the current product offering on the market? I'd like to know so that we can try to improve what has not been improved upon, right? Oh, there we go. The PM Auto sponsor driver Poom Cat just joined us. Thank you for joining us, Poom, whose nickname is Earth, the coolest nickname ever. Wondrick, first gen RX-7 question mark? Do we have a fast road for first gen RX-7 FB?
No, we don't. Yeah, I don't know if it's the same person, but I think this might be the second time someone's asked for an FB application. Yeah, as usual, if there's enough interest, we can definitely consider it. For us to take on an application that we haven't really thought of, like, let me give you an example. Neither of us are Volkswagen guys, so sometimes someone will ask about a VW, and it's not a car that we typically think about first at the team here, because just our general interest have steered towards other cars. But for us to start a new application, we just ask that we have one person that's interested, and they have two more that are also interested. And if we have some confirmed deposits in those, then that can also bump us up on the R&D program. So if you have an oddball car that you think that there's going to be interest for the product, but we don't know it yet, that is one way that you can get our attention.
Burstcraft says, we got you covered with the NANB ship is ready to sail.
Awesome.
And of course, DC5 too. Victoria asks, how much does ride height affect suspension?
Ooh, a lot.
So I have a question then, Grant. Why don't I just go as low as possible? Isn't low the lower the better, right?
Yeah. No, there's a lot of reasons for that. It's everything. I'm just imagining all these like formulas and graphs in my head. There's a lot of stuff to sort through on this, but there's vehicle dynamics is somewhat complicated. There's a lot of moving pieces, literally moving pieces that come into play, and a lot of it comes down to roll centers. I'll give you guys an example. We studied the IS300 a while back, and did you guys know that one common spring rate that was used on racing IS300s back in the day and for the TRD program was something like 50 kilograms per millimeter in the front and something similar in the rear, some absurdly high spring rate. And, we looked at the motion ratio and it's pretty low. That you do need a high spring rate because it's a heavy car. So that means that there's, the car can put more leverage onto the spring. But what the car also suffers from is a really bad roll center. And what that means is if the center of gravity of the car may be up here, maybe around the dashboard level of the car, roughly speaking, and the roll center is the imaginary point on the suspension where the forces will leverage the center of gravity on that. And it's dictated by essentially how the angle of the control arms and some imaginary lines across there. But on those cars in particular, if you start to lower them, that roll center goes way, way, way below ground. And you can take a car that has, a good suspension setup that doesn't have too much roll, isn't super firm on the street. And if you just lower it another inch or inch and a half, it can just become complete garbage really quickly. So yeah, it really depends on the car, but and unless you study that suspension yourself, you kind of probably need to drive a few cars or ask around to see what people have liked. But if you look at the control arms and you start to see them start to angle way, way down, that's usually not a good sign, and that can cause a lot of roll even though you have high spring rates.
You can watch our video with Jeff Wolfson's EG Civic where we talk about setting bump stop height because the upper control arms, really common on that chassis, will hit the body on the car.
Yeah, it's true. That's a physical reason why you don't want to lower those cars too much, because the control arm will literally contact the chassis.
Burstcraft has an answer for our Miata question. As for Miata offerings, it's a harsh contrast in quality versus price. It's either subpar imported eBay coils versus $2,500 plus type high quality. And he lists a bunch of company brands, but it's funny because that sounds very much like the golden era Honda we're dealing with right now. It's either very poor or the pointy end of the spectrum.
Or a lot of used stuff.
Apparently. Or a lot of used.
Yeah.
We have 5 minutes left on the live, so please get your questions in. I have one that I want to note that's a common thing too is really quick. Poom, the PM AutoWorks sponsor driver asks, spring rate for the GT86. So what spring rates what are some common spring rates for the FRS that we offer on the Annex setup?
Yeah, so for guys with mostly, and I'm talking about 8.6 Drive Challenge rules in particular, because that's where most of our experience is. But for the guys that are racing with tires like AO52, which is generally regarded as a pretty proper, weekend road racer tire, that I believe is still DOT. Yeah, I think it's still a DOT approved tire. It's not like a slick, but yeah, on a setup like that with a mostly stock car, we might run a 9K setup, or maybe a 9K and then 10K in the rear setup. Could be a little higher than that as well. And then if we have someone that has a more modified car with, sphericals, aero, maybe even grippier tire, you might see something like an 11 and 12K or 10 and 11K setup, or maybe even higher. That's another option that we might be testing out with soon. So yeah, that's the general ballpark.
We have 5 minutes left in the live. We have one more question, but I saw your face. Did you have one more thing you wanted to add?
Oh yeah, just there's a common trend where for various cars, when the only options out there are really low cost options, or a shock and a spring combo, or you start to only see like really high end and there's nothing really in the middle. A lot of that is because to get the good stuff, it takes a lot of time. So to build a shock that matches side to side, it takes quite a bit of human time to build those shocks. So that's one thing to consider is like, yeah, you may not like that price point that's up there, but usually it's not that those companies are price gouging. It's just that even after we've talked with some of these engineers at these companies, it'll take a long time to get a shock to match really well. And if you want that, then you're gonna have to pay for someone's labor to get to that point, or the companies need to do really clever things to get the shocks to match, or things like that. But yeah, the biggest factor is time.
I was gonna say PM AutoWorks has a friend who works at another shock manufacturer, and we asked him like, hey, sometimes we have shocks that take forever to try to get to match or hit our target. Is that common? And what was he saying? Like, yeah, sometimes it'll take the whole day for that guy to match a shock.
Yeah.
Whole work day to match two shocks together, front, like left and right.
I'm waiting for an amen from a Winjo.
Cool. DC5 Twisties, you have a little more complex question for the 2 minutes left we have in the live. So please, next time in 2 weeks when we have a live, it's like rake.
That's okay.
Yeah. So please, in 2 weeks when we do Instagram live again, ask us your question ahead of time, because that's 100% way to guarantee that we will answer your question on the live. Thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, everyone who has supported us in any way. And again, August 22nd, Grant and I will be driving, and majority of the Annex staff should be there, including the media staff.
Yeah, I hope to see you guys there. And yeah, just one more thing. If there's other stuff that you guys want us to do or talk about here, let us know. Maybe there's some process that we might feel comfortable like talking about or showing some more parts. Whatever you guys want to see, just let us know. We're here to serve you guys and just to try to get more info out there about suspension and this whole world and this. So just let us know.
I Schultze says, Thanks, Grants, and Ezekiel. There's only one Grants, not plural. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you guys.
See you guys next
Have a nice
time.
weekend.